Good afternoon. I'm Elizabeth Davis, Executive Vice President and Provost, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to Baylor University. Today is a very special day in the life of the university as we officially welcome Dr. Jean Bethke Elshtain to her new role at Baylor as Visiting Distinguished Professor of Religion and Public Life. Professor Elshtain also holds the Laura Spelman Rockefeller Professor of Social and Political Ethics within the Divinity School at the University of Chicago. She's written many important books, writes frequently for journals of civic opinion, and lectures widely on themes of democracy, ethical dilemmas, religion and politics, and international relations. She's a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. She's been a Guggenheim Fellow, a fellow at the Bellagio Center of the Rockefeller Foundation, the holder of the McGuire Chair in Ethics at the Library of Congress, a fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton, and a member of its board of directors. In 2002, she received the Goodnow Award, the highest award bestowed by the American Political Sciences Association for distinguished service to the profession. She served on the board of the National Humanities Center and on the President's Council of Bioethics. Currently, she's a member of the Council of the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Scholars Council of the Library of Congress. Jean will be based in Baylor's Institute for Studies of Religion, where she will conduct and produce new scholarship at the intersection of religion and public life. I'm delighted to let you all know that in Jean's new role as a Baylor professor, she's already working with faculty, as well as undergraduate and graduate students in political science, philosophy, and the Honors College. Now, I want to make a point of clarification. Don't be misled by the appearance of the word visiting in her title. We're optimistic that Dr. Elshtain's Baylor post will be anything but short-term. In fact, today's lecture, The Ups and Downs of a Christian Political Philosopher, is but the first of a series of university-wide lectures Professor Elshtain has agreed to offer at Baylor University every fall semester. Now, if you've kept up with our news releases, you're aware of this next bit of news I want to share with you. It's so significant that it merits recognition today. Earlier this month, the National Endowment for Democracy presented its Democracy Service Medal to Professor Elshtain. This prestigious award recognizes individuals who have made significant contributions to the progress of democracy around the world. The medal was first awarded in 1999 to former Polish president and founder of the Solidarity Trade Union movement, Lech Walesa. That first presentation was made on the 10th anniversary of the agreement that led to the peaceful transition to democracy in Poland. The medal has since been presented to a wide range of individuals who have demonstrated, through personal commitment, their dedication to the advancement of freedom and human rights and to the building of democratic institutions. Last year's winner was the Dalai Lama. In recognition of this great honor just bestowed on her, would you please join me in providing a warm welcome to one of the newest members of the Baylor faculty, Professor Jean Bethke Elshtain.
Well, thank you very much for that too generous introduction. I want to thank Byron Johnson, who's right here in the front row, without whom I would not be here today. He's a very persistent person, as some of you may know, and continued to discuss Baylor possibilities with me, and finally we were able to work something out. I also want to express my gratitude to Frances, who's in the second row, Frances Malone, for all her assistance in making the arrangements. I'm happy to see members of the faculty and students here, and I want to turn immediately to my topic for today, for this afternoon. Now, some of you may know that I'm a member of that strange breed called the public intellectual. Now, how one earns that designation is a bit of a mystery, but it has something to do with the fact that some of us feel driven to make pronouncements to and for a public of some kind about the direction of our society and more generally of the world of which we are a part. Amazingly, at least some of the people, some of the time, seem to pay us some attention. And if this goes on for a reasonable period, we become public intellectuals. Now, there are particular perils associated with this calling. I quipped a few years ago that the danger of being a public intellectual is that as one becomes more and more public, one becomes less and less intellectual. That is, one is so busy opining that one spends insufficient time going back to the wellsprings of scholarship that are one's foundation and one's true calling. So I think that's a real peril, and one has to guard against it. Now, I have been chosen to speak of that calling, or I have chosen to speak of that calling, of what it means in America, or has meant over the past 40 years or so. My first publication in a national journal of civic opinion was in 1969 when I was a graduate student. I've chosen to talk about what it means to be a political philosopher, but with a special designation, that is, one who accepts the name Christian. Now, it was not always so. So in order to address my topic, a little trip down memory lane, if you will be so kind as to join me, is necessary. And I should tell you that I'm always a bit uneasy about this sort of thing, about saying too much that is personal in public, because I abhor our contemporary cheap confessional culture. You know what I have in mind: the daily pity parties, as some call them, on American television, where everybody divulges every deep, dark secret, and people scream and cry, and forgiveness comes on the cheap. We seem to think nowadays that displaying every aspect of ourselves, ripping open our chests to show our beating hearts, entitles us to say anything we want, at any time and anywhere. Now, here my good old-fashioned Lutheran reticence comes into play. There are some things that are best kept private, best kept to oneself. One doesn't unload the totality of oneself on others. That can be a way to smother them, to deny their being as distinct from oneself. As Albert Camus insisted, we all have our ravages and our places of exile, but we have a duty not to unleash them on others. So I hope I won't unleash anything this afternoon, but it is necessary, if I am to address our topic, to go over some personal matters that illustrate more general and universal themes. I am convinced that most of what we experience isn't unique to us alone, but is widely shared by many others, even as we share with them our humanity and our ineffable human dignity. Now, when I began full-time teaching in 1973, it was, as many of you know, a tumultuous moment in American life. The sometimes bloody conflicts of the 1960s, both domestic and foreign, had scarred the body politic. The summer before I started my teaching presented the salacious scandal of Watergate, and I was second to none in rooting for Richard Nixon to be taken down. In general, I was a liberal in the sort of old-fashioned sense, a supporter of civil rights. I was against the war in Vietnam, but I was not in favor of all that was done in opposing that war. I was pro-feminist, although I was opposed to much that went under the name of feminism, and so on. The campus environment that I entered was strongly slanted in a certain direction, a left-wing direction. At the same time, many of the faculty I encountered, including my colleagues in political science, were old-fashioned liberals in a certain sense. They lived according to their best understanding of what it meant to be responsible members of the professoriate. They really believed in a meritocracy and judging people on their accomplishments and so forth. Now, the milieu was, as I've indicated, rather one-sided, although this was not an issue that concerned me at the time. But there were strange moments that seeped through that I recalled years later. They didn't make too much of an impact at the time, but if they all added up, it suggests that I had a sense of some disquiet, even then, about certain things that were going on. I recall a fellow professor who was not in my department, I hasten to add, chastising me for assigning Edmund Burke's great book, Reflections on the Revolution in France, to my class, because Burke was, quote, opposed to the French Revolution, end of quote. Now, I was already predisposed to be rather dubious about the French Revolution myself, and this long before serious criticism of the revolution began to emerge in France with a new scholarship. But I was predisposed that direction because I'd read Albert Camus' brilliant critique of the excesses of the terror in his great essay, The Rebel. But I was so oriented in a particular direction myself that for a brief moment, I felt guilty about having my students read Edmund Burke. Now, that didn't stop me from assigning him, but it did teach me how easy it is, or would be, to succumb to the general climate that surrounds us all. Then there was the time I assigned in a class on modern political thought Pope John Paul II's great essay on labor, Laborum Exergens, his encyclical. One aroused student complained that at a state university, assigning such religious stuff surely violated something. And so it was probably church-state separation. And she was joined by several others who trekked over to the chair of the Department of Political Science to complain. And my reaction was disbelief. I was genuinely stupefied for a moment or two before I could gather my thoughts in order to respond with some high-sounding words about academic freedom. But again, these are straws in the wind, so to speak. Let me just note that liberalism at its best encourages vigorous debate and insists that we assess ideas qua ideas, not whether they support some ideological agenda or another. So the problem was never, it seems to me, that my academic surround was too liberal in that sense. The problem was that certain trends were deep down about as illiberal as you can possibly be. That is, we came up with a designation, political correctness, to name this phenomenon. Trafficking in ideological absolutes, denouncing those who dissented, ostracizing the heterodox, enshrining subjects of dubious value as worthy to be listed with Western political philosophy or medieval history or mathematics or the novels of Herman Melville or Willa Cather. And the reason for this enshrining as an academic subject was frankly and openly ideological, and this was made explicit to promote activism and advocacy, rather than to study dispassionately and fairly a given subject matter, and to let the chips fall where they may. Now, in my work in these early years, I did not identify myself as having any particular religious beliefs, in part because I didn't know if I had them myself. I was going through one of a number of periods of doubting and spiritual turmoil in which I could not pray, Lord, I believe, help thou mine unbelief, because I could not say, Lord, I believe, with any conviction. Now, in 1981, in a conversation with the wife of one of the world's most famous philosophers, this was at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, I listened as she talked about some tasks she was undertaking on behalf of solidarity in Poland, something quite specifically Christian and Catholic. And she indicated that certain aspects of this task would probably not concern me because I, referring to me, was an unbeliever. And I flinched at the word, and I thought, no, that can't be right. I cannot be an unbeliever. I may not know what I believe, but I'm certainly no unbeliever. Now, one can add some evidence from my work, from my first book, Public Man, Private Woman, subtitled Women in Social and Political Thought, where I included in the discussion folks that were not routinely taken up by those teaching political theory in the academy. Their names were not on the syllabus for the most part, and so on. St. Augustine, St. Thomas, Martin Luther, John Calvin. And as well, I observed certain, if you will, religious moments or meaning in some of what the political theorists were doing that was not often noted. For example, it seemed to me that Rousseau's discussion of becoming a citizen in his social contract was a secular mimesis and a kind of imitation, if you will, of a religious ceremony in which one takes off the old and puts on the new in Christ. But in Rousseau, it wasn't in Christ, but one owes one's life to the state, to the social contract. Now, whether one goes along with that interpretation or not, the point is that religious references, allusions, parables, historic developments, along with great religious thinkers, were prominent throughout this book. And in the book's concluding chapter on a new political order, I called it Towards an Ethical Polity. I used terms and phrases like bearing witness and where two or three are gathered together. And then, and this is really the truth, I was surprised when one reviewer of the book suggested that Jean Bethke Elshtain might, gasp, be a Christian. For heaven's sake, I muttered, cannot one discuss these matters without being explicitly a believer? And I was a bit vexed. Actually, on some level, I think I was right to be. That is, one should not make unwarranted assumptions, and any good and wise political thinker should incorporate those thinkers and modes of thought that have helped to shape the world of which we are a part. And in the West, that means Christianity. We omit this at our peril. We become more stupid, to be blunt, less learned, less coherent. We lose contact with the sources and forces that have, for better or worse, made us who we are as persons and as cultures. Now, around this time, I took to rereading St. Augustine's Confessions. I remember picking up a novel by Georges Bernanos called Diary of a Country Priest, other works by Christian writers. And I realized that the primary reason that I thought we needed religion was to somehow get good people. But I decided that that wasn't really it. One didn't have to be religious to be a law-abiding citizen. I knew that Christianity was a deeper and more powerful mystery than that, and could not be captured in functionalist terms. That is, it was not reducible to some instrumental value. Now, interestingly enough, as my career progressed, nearly all the topics I took up and made the focus of my work forged together ethics and politics. I didn't even set out to do this explicitly. It was just the way I did things. I couldn't think of any other way to talk about politics. How could one talk about politics without taking up the ethical implications of our political claims and commitments? And when ethics entered the picture, it was ethics as I had inherited it, derived from the Christian tradition in its multiple manifestations. I did not have the language for it then, but I was insisting, again without knowing I was doing this, that we must not forget Jerusalem, that the West emerged out of the clash and coming together of Athens and Jerusalem. So the query of the early church fathers, what has Athens to do with Jerusalem or Jerusalem with Athens, was, it seemed, a great deal, although both Athens and Jerusalem had their doubts from time to time. So whether it was the family in relation to the polity, war, power and authority, interpretations of classical texts, the condition of democracy, bioethics and genetic engineering, stem cells and abortion, and increasingly religion and theology and politics, the connection of Christian to philosopher became more explicit and more robust. And as the years passed, I found that many of those responding to my work came not from departments of political science, but from schools of religion and divinity schools, people who are moral philosophers and so forth. And these new interlocutors brought explicit religious questions with them. In responding to their concerns and challenges, I deepened my own engagement with sources that had, after all, been central to my own formation. I came out of the closet, you might say. By this, I don't mean that I turned my work into apologia or confession, but that the explicit nurturing by Christian ethics and theology came more to the fore. And then there was the moment, some 17 years or so ago now, when I received a telephone call. I was at Vanderbilt at the time, from a man who identified himself as the dean of the Divinity School at the University of Chicago. They had been searching for someone to fill a position in social and political ethics for a few years, and he asked, would I be interested in journeying up to Chicago to have a look at them and they at me? And I was, again, puzzled. A divinity school? I asked the dean, you do know what I do, yes? And he replied they did, and they thought it was perhaps the sort of thing that might fit at Chicago. And I was excited from my first moments at Chicago and realized fairly quickly that it would be a good academic home. For one thing, I wouldn't have to continue to fight some very tedious battles on the ground of epistemology, and I will not bore you with those. But most of those, in the minds of those who were going to be my new colleagues, had been settled and in favor of the general position I embraced. So they were obviously very intelligent people. So that was an enormous relief to me. Now, being at a divinity school does not guarantee that one is a believer of any sort, of course, in a doctrinal or confessional sense. Indeed, according to one wag, there are plenty of professors in divinity schools for whom God is a dirty word. And I can actually personally name a few of whom that is true. But the world does not see it that way. If your mailing address is divinity school, then you have openly joined the ranks of those concerned with certain matters, and you are likely to be someone who believes, or at least believes, that people should believe, or they have believed. Now, around this time, I no longer felt the need for any quibbles or caveats. I was both a Christian and a political philosopher. Would I designate myself a Christian political philosopher? Well, not quite in that way. As much of what I have to say is not explicitly Christian. It has no label on it marked Christian. And I wouldn't want to suggest that what I have to say is exclusively or narrowly Christian and looked at from, a narrow singular point of view. That said, I make it clear that the thoughts I think and the things I am concerned with and the beliefs I embrace and the hopes I cherish are all shaped by the Christian's belief in incarnation, crucifixion, and resurrection. I am not sophisticated enough to put those profound matters in a more lofty way. I always liked the story about the great Flannery O'Connor, who's one of our finest and quirkiest writers. In a letter to her, reader of her works, and I didn't go back and look it up, so I'm doing this from memory, and there are students of O'Connor at this university who will correct me if I'm wrong, but suggested that Miss O'Connor, she would have hated Miss O'Connor, certainly made good use of various symbols and figures of speech derived from Catholic Christianity, but surely she herself didn't believe a lot of that stuff. And O'Connor wrote back in that feisty way of hers that if it was all just a bunch of empty symbols, then, and wasn't the truth, then to hell with it, which was probably a shock to her interlocutor. So either Jesus was God incarnate or he was not, and so on. Now, I know that such statements are embarrassingly simplistic to many, including many Christian scholars, but I just never got over my Luther Small Catechism formation. Anyone out there who's a Lutheran who has read Luther's Small Catechism knows that you take the various articles of the creed, and then Luther offers an explanation of the meaning of the article, and then he often ends that explanation with the words, "This is most certainly true." And a staple of, how often do we get to say that anymore? And a staple of Luther's own writing, for better or for worse, some people wish he'd been, held it in a little bit from time to time, but is his blunt forthrightness. He gets straight to the point, and you're not left with major doubts about where he stands. Now, I like to think that my work is evidence that complex thought and a pretty direct, simple faith are not at odds with one another. To me, it is the faith of my mother and father. It's the faith of my beloved Aunt Martha, who died relatively recently. She was the most generous-hearted and bravest persons I have ever known, one of the most, and she embodied what a lived faith should be. For her, Christianity was, again, pretty simple. It was about love. She had never read Karl Barth. She knew nothing about various neo-orthodoxies or hermeneutics or all the rest, but she would have agreed with the great Karl Barth when he replied to the query, "What is the single most important thing a Christian should believe?" And Barth answered, "Jesus loves me, this I know." Now, my Aunt Martha knew, and if I can partake even a bit of her rollicking faith, she had a great sense of humor, a great sense of God's good humor, then I would see that as a great blessing. I agree fully with the lines that the playwright Robert Bolt puts into the mouth of St. Thomas More in his powerful play transformed into a film some of you are surely familiar with, A Man for All Seasons, where More says that God made man to serve him wittily in the tangle of his mind. I take that to mean that God gave us powerful minds to serve him. We do not serve God if we shut down our intellects. We do not serve if we refuse to use our educated powers. And if we do these things, it means we are bound to be at odds with the dominant culture of our time, of any time, in particular ways. For the ways of the world and the ways of faith do not cohere effortlessly and never have. The Christian lives on an edge, both loving the world, amor mundi, and against the world, Contramundum. Now, St. Augustine quite brilliantly limed the ways the city of God and the earthly city, God's saints on their earthly pilgrimage, made possible genuine goods. For the lives of the saints, he tells us, is a social life, and we can be happy only in common with our fellows. We seek a measure of justice on this earth, a tranquility of order, he called it, tranquillitas ordinis. We share much with our fellows as human beings and as citizens. Where we differ, as St. Augustine pointed out, is in the direction of our loves. Christians are oriented to the ultimacy of God, the summum bonum, not to, if you will, the penultimacy of the state. That's not the highest loyalty. That's not the object of full devotion, not the state. Christians do not fashion polities and then idolize that of their own fashioning, or should not. Christians do not build altars to their own self-conceit, do not create monuments mirroring their narcissism, or at least should not. Now there's more. Scripture tells us, be not afraid. And who among us who witnessed this moment on television, in my own case, when Pope John Paul II first emerged as the newly elected pontiff in St. Peter's Square back in 1978, and his first words to the assembled multitude were, be not afraid. I think Pope John Paul taught more people not to be afraid in the last half of the 20th century than did any other public figure. Now, I have many times been puzzled when one of my academic peers tells me that I've shown courage in having written thus and so or said this or that. And I think, that doesn't really take much courage. Courage is sheltering Jews, knowing you and your family will pay a terrible price were this to be discovered if you lived in Germany in 1941. Courage is racing up the stairs in the World Trade Centers looking for survivors as thousands race down, trying to escape the inferno. Courage is the mother or father tending to a terminally ill child without falling into bitterness of heart. But the fact that I'm told this tells me in turn just how timorous we often are in the academy, unless what we have to say meshes with the general opinion around us, unless it will earn us kudos from our fellows. No one wants to be on the outside looking in. And the name political correctness has emerged as a way to characterize what too often seems a dreary conformity, and the fact that we celebrate diversity, but we have so little of it often, where it really matters. Diversity in points of view, in approaches. I saw some data recently about our elite law schools, where in the case of one of the most famous, not a single faculty member identified himself or herself as a Republican. Now, in schools where there were Republicans, they were thin on the ground. In departments of political science, we find that it hovers around 90%, but certainly in the mid to high 80s are registered Democrats and so on, and I dare say the same pertains in our elite divinity schools. Now, bear in mind, be careful about what I'm saying here. I'm not equating Republican to what's worthy and true. Not at all. I'm not making a brief for any party. I simply want to, and I wouldn't be too happy if the figures were the other way either. I simply want to display the consensus that prevails. So much so that those who depart from the orthodoxy seem not so much wrong as completely unintelligible to their colleagues. And people often describe to me the reaction they've received from some of their colleagues who say things like, but you're so intelligent, how can you possibly, and go on, how can you possibly believe this or that, or have voted for so-and-so? As if one political party or one orientation has cornered the market on brains. So it takes a bit of gumption, that's for sure, to go against the grain, to feel isolated from one's fellows, or to sense they're pulling away from oneself, a phenomenon that I've had described to me over and over again by people in often rather unhappy situations, and is a phenomenon I've experienced personally up to a certain point. Many there are who are fearful about tenure and promotion, if they are too open about their views and positions, if these do not mesh with the reigning Weltanschauung. One does not want to take a chance on jeopardizing one's good standing. And I'm wondering why on earth there should be uniformity of opinion among citizens, including professors, about daunting and complex matters, sometimes matters of life and death. If we cannot debate such issues in the academy, where can we debate them nowadays? Christians especially should recognize immediately the morally fraught nature of abortion, bioethics, capital punishment, war and peace, and other questions on which some of us have made pronouncements over the years. So I really cannot understand monologic conformity on these issues within our elite institutions. And I certainly will not conform myself to some undebated unanimity on vital topics. So there are a number of perils for the political philosopher who is a believer, depending on his or her context, of course. First, there are those who are thoroughly enmeshed in a secularist worldview. And here I want to distinguish between the secular and secularism. We live in a secular world. We live in a country with a secular state. There's no religious establishment, and that's fine. So I distinguish that from secularism, which is a full-blown ideology that rejects altogether any appeal to transcendence. Right? So those who are caught in that worldview find unintelligible and even unacceptable and illicit references drawn from Christian sources, and not Christian alone, religious sources and beliefs in the world of scholarship. Second, even among the company of Christians, there may be a censorious conformity on certain issues, and some may come down hard if one departs from their company. That is, Christian scholars are by no means exempt from some of these tendencies. I was, for example, written, if you'll forgive another self-reference, written out of the Christian community by several reviewers of one of my books, a book called Just War Against Terror. It wasn't that they disagreed with the book, which they did, they loathed it in fact. That's fine so long as one is prepared to argue out one's points, but rather the attack was directed at me, and one of the polemical claims was that I was not in fact a Christian, for no Christian by definition could ever hold the views that I espoused in that volume. Now, one can dismiss such charges, or one can try to dismantle them, but they're troubling nonetheless because they show this push, again, towards a kind of political correctness on a whole range of issues. But I think one should persevere as one is able. As I've already suggested, if tenured professors who have just about the most secure job in the world are afraid to raise a bit of a ruckus and to go out on a limb, then shame on them. Shame on us. What kind of example are we to our students if we do not model for them how conscientious adults can disagree with one another and yet remain civil? If we do not model this, where are our students to learn it? We lament the state of our political society and our political debates, but we seem incapable of taking upon ourselves the task of generating what my late friend, the historian Christopher Lasch, called a culture of democratic argument. Now, I think the best way that I can use the time remaining to me is to offer some concrete examples about current controversies and what Christian sources bring to the table, so to speak. I certainly cannot compass them all, but I want us to think briefly about the use of force or war, genetic engineering and related matters, and democracy and human rights. Now, glancing at each, someone might say that we are perfectly capable of discussing these matters without any reference to Christianity or to Christian sources. And I would grant them that in this sense. They need make no explicit reference to Christianity, but there is no way that you can do an adequate job of taking up any of these matters if you try to do so while dispensing altogether with Christian sources or recognition of the conceptual, historical, and ethical work that Christianity has done over the centuries. So on the use of force, we have the long tradition of ethical limits to warfare, an attempt to make warfare less brutal and less destructive, called the just war tradition, to evaluate both occasions for the use of force and the kinds of weaponry used, what's done, even in a justified war. And the primary emphasis there is on protection of non-combatants, protection of the innocent. And I submit to you that it's impossible to think of this whole tradition emerging with the robustness that it has, absent the long tradition within Christianity begun by Christians on this issue. Genetic engineering, it all comes down finally to the anthropological question. What are human beings? What finally is the human person? What counts as a violation of the human person? What are the things that we are not permitted to do? What are the limits to what we should do, even if we can do them? So again, the resources are, the questions are there, and no matter how much you try, in the final analysis, it will come down to that rock bottom question about human beings. And there's going to be a huge difference between those who think that we are simply the accumulated product of forces at work either within us or external to us, or either biologically determined or economically determined and so on, and those who believe that human beings are marked by the imago Dei. Democracy and human rights. Once again, we get to the rock bottom grounding of human dignity that is not given by the state, cannot be arbitrarily taken away by the state. If democracy and human rights are not thus grounded, there is a tendency, I submit, to move to a kind of crude majoritarian system. And democratic procedures can become a way to divvy up the spoils. And human rights can be reduced to a way that we name our wants and our preferences. Well, I hope I've said enough to convince you, or at least remind us, of the importance and vitality of the Christian tradition to the world we live in today and how we live our lives in that world. And in my work of the past few years, including my Gifford Lectures book, Sovereignty, God, State, and Self, my inner theologian, if you will, is on full display, for better or worse. It means that a good bit of that book is rather tough slogging for some readers. But I want to conclude this afternoon in a manner that is down to earth and quite homey. So I would ask you to indulge me one more time for a few concluding moments as I read to you the short epilogue to that book. I should tell you that I had completed the book, and yet it didn't seem finished to me somehow. And I actually had a dream in which this little essay I'd written some years earlier somehow got into the dream. And I decided that that's the way the book should end. So I went back and found this little fragment, really, and put it as the epilogue. And I think you will discern immediately that thoughts such as those on display in this short piece are indelibly shaped by the truths and beauties of the Christian faith. There's really no other place they could have come from. So this is the epilogue, or the afterword. And it's with this that I'm going to conclude. This is a story of empty pockets. During a recent trip to Rome, I enjoyed an evening in the company of a group that included a young Jesuit who had spent a year in El Salvador and was due to return there soon. At one point over the course of the evening's discussion, Father Michael described a time he had spent in one of the L'Arche communities founded by Jean Vanier. Jean Vanier is a Canadian born in Montreal. L'Arche began in 1964 when Vanier bought a home in rural France and invited 2 adults with mental retardation to live there with him, to live in community with him. Some 60 L'Arche communities now exist worldwide. The guiding spirit behind L'Arche differs dramatically from the therapeutic paternalism that often structures relationships between the normal and the mentally handicapped. L'Arche is a community dedicated to the unlikely proposition that the able should not do things to or for the less able, but should instead live with them in covenant. Writes Vanier, handicapped people are teachers of the strong. With their tremendous qualities of heart and lives of faith and love, the handicapped give testimony to the truth that the privileged place for meeting with God is in our vulnerability and weakness. Now, I thought of Vanier's words as I listened to Father Michael tell a story of empty pockets. At L'Arche, Michael helped to dress and clean a profoundly handicapped young man. And one day it struck him that this young man went out of his room and into his world and through his life every single day with empty pockets. Father Michael thought of how odd that was. No wallet, no change, no keys, another dinner guest and I exclaimed simultaneously, showing no doubt both our automotive and professional preoccupations. And in my own case, domestic concerns also help to account for my outbursts concerning keys to one's home being central to one's sense of place and self. The real problem, Father Michael decided, was not with his handicapped brother, but, as he put it, with me and my ideas of him and what he felt. And as Father Michael said these words, he put his hand over his heart, and I mused and remarked on how the heart's understanding of humanity is often much more generous and expansive than definitions that rely on measures of intelligence or productive capability. And this led those at the table to turn to the growing eugenics enthusiasm that was returning to the West, with its technocratization of birth and its tacit conviction that the world would be better off if they, the handicapped with their empty pockets, were no longer to appear among us. It is important to note that the urge to eliminate those handicapped biogenetically is a view often born of compassion. But this compassion quickly turns perverse because it is a free-floating, untethered sentimentalization, devoid of context and concrete experience or engagement with those with empty pockets. As I was driven back to my room near the Santa Maria Maggiore on that becalmed, warm Roman night, I felt a spreading sorrow which has remained with me, for I am convinced that our reigning metaphors of success and productivity, of what counts as definitive of the human, will more and more leave our fellow human beings with their empty pockets in the shadows, eclipsed outside the circle of concern. And here the unbearable lightness of a certain sort of triumphalist and narrow secularism, I know not what else to call it, can be seen as exacting a terrific toll in its heady great leaps always forward, always upward, pockets full of keys, inexorably extending and deepening not our awe and humility, but our drive for sovereign control. And I remembered one of Vanier's warnings. One of the dangers in our world is wanting to do big, heroic things, but we are called to do little things lovingly, to work to create community. And to conclude, you don't need full pockets to be a citizen of this polity. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
Gene's going to take a few questions.
Right.
And
I'm going to sit for these if you'll forgive me. Thank you so much. And we'll, okay, I've got water and a mic, so I'm ready to go. Okay. I think, is this on? Yes, it's on. We're good.
Which of your works best represent your evolved ideas of political ethics?
Well, I would say that the most recent work, the Gifford Lectures book, Sovereign God, Sovereign State, Sovereign Self, is the most developed argument, at least concerning the sources of our understanding in the West concerning the state, concerning the self, and the ways in which that tradition is a very complicated one with different understandings of sovereignty, some of which push us in directions that I think are deeply troubling, and some of which guard against those troubling tendencies. And one of my concerns, and it actually comes out of that little fragment on Empty Pockets, which I did back in 1992. I couldn't quite believe I did it then, because I obviously already had these thoughts in my mind, but they hadn't crystallized yet, that pushing towards a kind of self-sovereignty is precisely a way to lose the self, because one loses the recognition that the self is always a self in community, that we're born in communio, the self is never a self alone, and yet there's this whole push, and it must be said that some aspects of Christianity have lent great force to that, to the notion of a kind of fully autonomous self. We're a law unto ourselves. Now, when it gets pushed that far, clearly it starts to depart from the Christian tradition, which would never say you're simply a law unto yourself, because that means that you're sovereign and God is not, in a sense. But there's a way in which I suggest in the book, in modernity, we have come to really rankle at the notion that God is sovereign, because if that's true, then I'm not fully sovereign somehow. It takes away from my sovereignty and my will. And I think we lose a sight of the richness and fullness of the self and the true and the deepest understandings of freedom in that way. Because once you set wills in motion, and these sovereign selves in motion, there's only one way you can go. Some win and some lose. There's no other sort of possible way that we can live with and among one another, because whatever I give to you, I lose. It turns into this zero-sum notion of winners and losers. And I think that is a tendency, that's the way things have been going. Now, I know full well that on the ground, people live richer and fuller lives often than our theories account for. And our theories often express certain tendencies taken to an extreme. But I think it's important to spin out the logic, to spell out the logic of some of these arguments, and to warn us that, our practices may become more and more to conform to some of these theories if we ignore and lose the sources that sustain other notions, if I'm making sense to you, other understandings of the self and of community and of politics and all the rest. That is, if we don't continue to acknowledge those sources and to form young people in and through these traditions, at one point, what will we have to counter, some of the excesses that our own culture has generated? So I would say it's not a book of ethics in the sense of giving you your marching orders clearly, but of trying to understand sort of where we are and our thinking about selves. And when I thought I'd completed the book. This is even before I thought I'd completed it, that I described to you. I thought I'd finished it a couple of times when I hadn't. And I thought I would, it seemed so sort of gloomy about our prospects that I needed to really offer people some hope, because I'm not really a gloomy person. And And I think that there is hope out there. So I went back to the drawing board and thought about sources we could turn to, that are available to us. They're part of our conceptual repertoire, to lift up and to sustain, the kind of hope that can counter some of these excesses. And unsurprisingly, they're generated by a Christian culture. Even though it's certainly in one case, the person writing was an Italian Jew, but he's profoundly shaped, clearly by the narrative of his people, of Judaism and of Jerusalem, of Judaism and Christianity, and has that strength that he can bring to bear. This is Primo Levi and his account of being a prisoner in Auschwitz. So if those sources, if we come to a point where those are just artifacts, historic artifacts that make no sense to us, save as testimonies of a long gone time and place, then we really are in big trouble. If they don't touch something deeper in us.
Professor Elshtain, first, thank you so much.
Sure.
Question, I really did appreciate the biographical thrust of the lecture.
Thanks.
Though, in doing it that way, it left open a sort of more universal kind of question for me, which
Sure.
is the matter of the possibility of a kind of political philosophy that isn't Christian.
Yeah.
And it makes me wonder, I wanted to ask if you think, from your vantage point, there can be a political philosophy that's not Christian today. Of course, I say this very much having Plato and Aristotle in mind,
Sure.
and knowing that there's political philosophy before there's Christianity. So maybe the right way to put the question is to ask, how does a Christian political philosophy look different? Or what does it add to, or what does it make possible that we don't have in political philosophy classically conceived?
Well, David, it seems to me that it's almost on some level almost impossible to answer your question, because we read Plato and Aristotle from a vantage point that assumes Christianity in a sense. That is to say, we can't go back and read them naively, as if we're reading them in a pure sense, sort of uncontaminated by other historic forces and forms of knowledge and awareness. So we're reading them from a certain, after having gone through a certain formation ourselves, that is in many instances, not all, obviously, deeply shaped by Judaism and Christianity. So it's very difficult, it seems to me, to say that we can sort of isolate that off and as a standalone project, it can offer a coherent or robust sort of political philosophy for us, because our Aristotle made us, Aristotle came to us as through the long, complex routine, as you know, that goes through St. Thomas and on down to contemporary moral philosophers and virtue ethicists and so forth, all shaped by Aristotle and Aristotle's ethics and so on. I'm not trying to dodge the question. I'm just suggesting that we're such profoundly historical beings. It's not historical relativism I'm talking about, but kind of historic recognition, of the weight of tradition and centuries that we bear, and we either bear it rather happily, in gratitude for the riches that have been deeded to us, or we're pretty sour about it and would like to get rid of a lot of it. I think the current Pope, Benedict XVI, is interesting because that's his bailiwick. That's what he's really, as you may know, been trying to do, is to go back and look at the way in which those classical sources got wedded to Christianity. And he's interested in Christianity that doesn't lose contact with those sources, even as there are so many others that would like to either lose those sources for Christianity or lose Christianity in order to simply have those sources. So on a theoretical level, certainly you can imagine, we've got the text in front of us, a political philosophy that isn't Christian. But if you're thinking about a political philosophy as a way to think about the issues that we face today, it strikes me that one's appreciation of those issues will always be shaped by a reading of those sources that is itself shaped by the forces that have come subsequent to to the writings of Plato and Aristotle and so on. I have a hunch you might disagree in some particular, but we will pursue that later. Anyway, that would be my first stab at answering your question. And certainly there are things that are very, depending on if we're supposed to take Plato ironically and all that stuff, but you know, there's some very troubling things, obviously, in Plato's Republic and so forth about exposure of infants and a world where the family is a terrible threat. You have to have children of the guardian class removed from the mothers and put in a kind of separate sort of child area where they don't develop a deep attachment to a particular mother and so forth. Now, if we read that as a blueprint, which many people did actually, and tried to implement it, then you can see the terrible dangers of that. If you read it in some other way and don't think it's a political program, it does less damage, but it can be quite damaging. Aristotle was not so grand in his thinking about things and didn't write a utopia, but still, there are aspects certainly to Plato and to some of Aristotle as well, because he didn't really have a full concept or understanding the weakness of the will, it seems to me, and human frailty. I think that corrective really has to be applied to Plato and to Aristotle, and that's going to come obviously from outside the two of them. So.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for
Sure.
your lecture, and also thank you for joining us at Baylor.
Thank you.
And also want to thank those who made it possible for you to come.
Thank you. Thank you.
Change direction just a little bit, if I
Sure.
may.
Sure.
Would you offer a critique of the current political situation in our country? Starting with Washington,
Yeah.
what's going on in Congress, how you read that, and in the White House, the conflicts that we see. And also, if you could, what do you make of the growth of government bureaucracy in our country? I just saw today that now Washington is the wealthiest city in our country, an average salary of $126,000, and that's got to be largely bureaucrats within our federal government, I would think. But anyway, offer your observations, if you would, please.
Well, I clearly can't cover all of it, but let me do it in this way. In 1995, I wrote a book called Democracy on Trial, which took a look at the situation right then and the perils that were confronting American democracy. And there have been a number of folks who urged me to do a follow-up to that volume, and I talked to some folks here about it earlier today. And I think that would probably be a good idea, because I'd have to, in fact, take account of some of the things, the dreary facts that you have placed before us. Let me just talk about one issue, the many that one could pick up on to talk about. And that is the weakened state. Let me find the calmest way I can to put this. The weakened state of our political debates. I don't want to say they're completely debased, because I don't believe that. But we put a premium, as you know, the way in which television functions has exacerbated this, on people being able to get in there very quickly, make a few points, get a few sound bites that'll be on the news, at the 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock news and so forth. And as a result, there are a whole range of issues that are given, very complicated issues, that are given short shrift and that aren't really discussed with the amplitude and the, if you will, the reasonableness that they should be. In other words, we've got a problem with what I talked about in my lecture on the level of a culture of democratic argument, as Christopher Lasch called it. And one of the things that I know we don't do so much as we once did is to educate young people in our public schools in civics, just plain old-fashioned civics. How the government works, what your role as a citizen is, learning some of the basic sources of your own history and your own government. And I think we know that that helps to, when that's done, it helps to promote a sense of civic efficacy. And I think it also helps students to understand the ways in which they might, language in and through which they might debate civic matters, political matters with those who disagree with them. There have to be ways to, again, to model this and to offer this to young people. Because now it strikes me, and I talked about this in 1995, when you've got certain forms of, of a highly divided, self-interested politics, where you've got, for every issue, there's a separate interest group, and you've got identity politics. You've got, folks representing certain issues by race or by sexual orientation, a whole range of other questions. Then once again, we've got a culture that tends to say there are winners and losers, where my aim is not to work out some decent sort of compromise with you that's not perfect, but is to try to get what there is to get, because there's only a finite amount of it, and and if you get it, then I lose it. And I think that that's the context within which our discussions go forward right now. And I think that's tended to debase our political culture and our political debates. I know that not every political discussion can be Lincoln Douglas. I mean, we know that. Those are unusual even in that time, as you know. But there've got to be ways where we can, in an environment that is not condemnatory, not looking for the gotcha moment, permit our political candidates and so on to be a bit exploratory and to offer up possibilities to see what people think about them, and to take that into account, a more dialogical kind of enterprise. Because now what we do is punish people for having suggested something 10 years ago, that maybe didn't work out so well. But there's a process of social learning. You suggest something, perhaps it's implemented, it didn't work out the way you expected, then you need to go back and rethink that and why it didn't, but we don't permit that to people. You're defined by certain moments of failure primarily, and I think it's, I think the upshot of that is that we see, and of the enhanced role of money in politics. Money is, with the loss of party discipline and party organization, it's a more freelance enterprise now. Pretty much anyone, if they've got some funds, can try to run for office. But what we see within the heightened influence of money and the collapse of this culture of democratic argument, I think that helps to account for the phenomenon that you're describing and that you're rightly lamenting. On the issue of bureaucracy and so forth, that would be a much longer discussion, but I said I was going to do one thing, now I'm going to do two, but let me just say that the very important political theorist, 20th century political theorist, Hannah Arendt, once commented that bureaucracy is ruled by nobody. That's why it's so frustrating. You cannot find out to whom you should speak. You cannot find out where the decisions are being made. Everything is sort of lost in this thick, dense haze somehow. And the whole notion of accountability gets lost. And I think that's one reason so many people are so frustrated, because they know that all kinds of decisions are being made that will affect them, their children, their grandchildren, and the country as a whole, and they don't understand how these decisions are being made and how they're being implemented. All they know is that Tocqueville, in the second volume of Democracy in America, talks about the moment when Americans might one day wake up and find this dreadful stranger called government sort of looming there as a kind of imposition. And I think many Americans have come to that point, and that's a terrible thing. If you want to have a robust and decent democratic society. So mostly I've just repeated the problem, I'm sorry. But I think those are a couple of issues we need to explore further, to really get to a full answer to your question. So I think with that, I will officially stop with your permission. And I think Byron wants to say something before you're permitted to leave, so.
Jean's book that she's referenced is outside. There's a display out there, so if you'd like to pick up a copy, I think that would be great. And join me once again in thanking Jean Bethke.